The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Afghanistan, a nation shattered by 2 decades of near-continuous war. The US-Taliban peace agreement brought hopes of an end to the conflict, as did September's peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Today, those negotiations have reached a breakthrough. So, as US and NATO forces prepare to withdraw, after years of political flux, who will really govern Afghanistan? To discuss this and related questions, the Democracy Forum invites a panel of speakers who have been at the coalface of Afghanistan's long years of conflict, whether in key government roles, as special envoys or as writers and researchers. As the prospect of peace looms and the people of Afghanistan face a still uncertain future, please join us live at this hugely topical event, bringing your own insights and questions.
Welcome, thank you for being here wherever you are in the world. And my name's Humphrey Hawksley. I'm an author, a writer on Asia, former BBC Asia correspondent, and the moderator today of this great Democracy Forum event, Afghanistan, who will really govern? That's a good question. It may be an unanswerable one, or there may be some answers. But without further ado, I'm going to hand us over to Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, who from his home in Scotland will encapsulate the issues, the challenges, and what we need to examine today. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
On behalf of the Democracy Forum, I take great pleasure in welcoming you to this video enhanced seminar today. We're particularly pleased that the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan has agreed to contribute. And I also gratefully acknowledge the keynote speech by the Ambassador, His Excellency Syed Tayyib Jawad, which he gave at a similar event organized by the Forum 2 years ago. I'm sure you'll agree that we are extremely fortunate to have secured the participation of such an erudite panel, which will be chaired on your behalf by Humphrey Hawksley, and we're very grateful that he has agreed to act in this capacity again. It's perhaps inevitable that our review of topical issues should again select Afghanistan as a subject for the Forum's close attention. The country's plight is regularly covered by our sister publication, Asian Affairs Magazine, which I strongly recommend you should read. But wearied by 19 years of bloody conflict, estimated to have cost in excess of 200,000 lives since 2001, the world is now looking to the Afghan people and their representatives for a practical solution, and above all, a peaceful transition. If history is a reliable guide to Afghanistan's future as a well-governed nation state at peace with itself, then we have to be honest that it doesn't bode too well. There are too many striking parallels to ignore, where the withdrawal of occupying forces and subsidies have exposed a vacuum too deep to fill. 30 years ago, the Soviet Union began withdrawing its forces from Afghanistan. And over a century before Russian troops were pulled out, the British attempted to secure their foothold behind a line of control, the Durand Line. This caused the Emir of Afghanistan, Abdurrahman Khan, to write to the British Viceroy of India, expressing his concerns about the risk of withdrawal and imposition of a new border. "If you should cut the frontier tribes out of my dominions," he wrote, "they will neither be of use to you nor to me. You will always be engaged in fighting or other trouble with them, and they will always go on plundering. In your cutting away from me these tribes, you will injure my prestige in the eyes of my subjects, and that will make me weak, and my weakness is injurious for your government." Khan's letter to Lord Lansdowne, written in 1893, still carries a chilling threat for us today. Because on the one hand, he was imploring the British not to cease payments of subsidies, which had occurred in 1879 and again in 1918. While on the other hand, he anticipated the inevitable implosion of control and the collapse of civil government. Well, despite the lapse of nearly 130 years, these are still the issues essentially which our panelists will be discussing today. Following the conditional agreement reached 10 months ago in Doha between the United States and the Taliban, hopes were raised that the resumption of talks between the Afghan government, the Taliban leadership, and representatives of civil society could lead to a sustainable power-sharing agreement. But these intentions have been undermined by the American government's precipitous announcement to advance the withdrawal of its remaining forces before the end of Donald Trump's presidency in January next year, despite criticism of its allies. And as if to demonstrate the growing impunity of its militias, undeterred by the dwindling Western presence, in a single week in October, the Taliban carried out 356 attacks, 2 suicide bombings, and 52 IED explosions across Afghanistan, as the Washington Post reported. The Taliban have long defied their opponents with the taunt, "You may have the watches, but we have the time." But time may also be running out on their ascendancy. An article written by Sudha Ramachandran, published this month in Asian Affairs magazine, raises the spectre of a major rift opening up between the leadership of the Taliban, its principal allies, such as the Haqqani network, and insurgent groups, which include the Islamic State of the Khorasan province, ISKP. Indeed, it's thought jihadists attached to the latter were responsible for the atrocities carried out in Kabul in October and November. And in the background lies the shadowy hand of sponsorship representing state security forces in Pakistan, Iran, and the Arab world. Clearly, what Afghanistan needs now is the solid prospect of foreign direct investment, not state-sponsored subsidies to paramilitary organizations. The current situation is unsustainable. Foreign donors cover 75% of the country's operating budget. The United States alone pays $4 billion annually to subsidize the military and security forces. Interviewed for Asian Affairs in July, John Sopko, the Special Inspector for Afghanistan Reconstruction, an American watchdog, warned the Ashraf Ghani government must come to realize that in the end, private investment will matter far more to its country's future than international donors. Because after 19 years of war, foreign governments, including the United States, are weary of paying Afghanistan's bills. Well, I look forward to hearing how our panelists will lead us through this very complex situation. I hope you enjoy listening to the webinar, and indeed, I encourage you to participate in this extremely important topic by forwarding your comments and questions to the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce, for that concise, intricate, historical, rather worrying platform on which to begin our debate. And I repeat Lord Bruce's request, all of you watching, send in questions, challenge our panelists, challenge me, help us drill down so that we can come to some sort of conclusion. We have more than just a panel of experts. These are people who have shared the sweat, the tears, and the blood of this place that all of us know is one of heart-stopping beauty, generosity, and of violence, caught historically between the confluences of world powers. Its landscape is beautiful, its rivers thin like silvery ribbons, yet wide and furious like an angry canvas, and a history, as we've just heard, of complicated social and cultural networks. Who ever governed Afghanistan? In the mid-19th century, did the British? In the 1980s, did Moscow? Then in the 2000s, the first conquest in the war on terror, and look where we are now. Yet back in the 1970s, Afghanistan was a fashionable stopping place on the traveling Asian hippie trail when it was possible to drive from Singapore to Paris without a real risk of being attacked. Not anymore. The world has changed. The panel knows Afghanistan from every angle. Donor dependency, which we just heard about, outside powers, and of course, Joe Biden coming in. The path to real self-sufficiency and democracy, and possibly most crucially, the importance of local governance and scenarios for the future. We're going to hear all about that. And at the end, Barry Gardner, chair of Democracy Forum, former Shadow International Trade Secretary, will be here to wrap up the main points and give us his thoughts from his long experience, both as a frontline British politician and in global affairs. But first, we are very privileged to have Naveed Normal, the first secretary at the Afghan embassy in London. Naveed is going to open and give an overview of the current situation in Afghanistan and what the future might hold. Naveed, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. Thank you for having me at this timely discussion about peace in Afghanistan. I wish to also thank the Democracy Forum, Charles, for bringing about a very knowledgeable panel here today to discuss a very important topic, as we have a breakthrough with the negotiations between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban recently in Doha. There are definitely some optimisms and as well as pessimisms that are mixed with some challenges and concerns. The reason for us to be optimistic about the peace process in Afghanistan is that people from all walks of life in Afghanistan, including the fighters of the Taliban group, are tired of the bloodshed and the war in Afghanistan. And there is a consensus over ending this long war in Afghanistan through a political settlement. For sure, peace is not a desire anymore for the people of Afghanistan, but it's also a need. We have lost so many precious lives, and we are still losing lives to this nonsensical war. With that, we have also lost many opportunities as a nation, as a country. We definitely have a national consensus within Afghanistan for peace, and there is also an international consensus over this matter. But the question that remains very critical and important is what kind of peace are we looking for? We call it a dignified and lasting peace, but what does that mean? Like, I think we can translate that into a peace where any Afghan is able to vote without fear or without any discrimination. Again, with the question that is asked for this forum, who will really govern Afghanistan? Whoever governs Afghanistan, it's really important that we make sure that the country is driven by the interests of the people of Afghanistan and of the region, for sure. I'm not going to talk about the details of what the Afghan government has done so far to reach to this point and to this breakthrough that we're talking about. However, we should all appreciate that the government of Afghanistan has shown a goodwill for peace. They have given so many concessions, and in return, we at least hope that that there's a ceasefire and stopping and killing of civilians, which is going on even now. We all know that Afghanistan is a country with a very young country, with almost 70% of its population under the age of 30, and most of them probably have not even experienced the difficult times under the Taliban regime. So with no doubt, this big mass population will have different opinions about peace process, which they are definitely entitled to. For sure, you will have someone with a different opinion who is living in a very remote area of Afghanistan and about peace, compared to someone who is living in Kabul, for example, and is educated and is working in a place where he can provide for himself. So for delays is definitely a challenge in the peace talk, but that's something very normal. It's concerning the people of Afghanistan, and the reason for that is the level of violence that has been increased. Unfortunately, recently we have been seeing that the tactic of war has changed, kind of from, let's say, from suicide bombings now to more of a targeted assassinations. We have lost so many lives in the past couple of months, and a part of the problem, I think, here is that the peace agreement is not what the deal between the US and the Taliban have been. Like that, we should make sure that we are not mixing the deal between the US and the Taliban with a peace agreement that has to be basically dealt with between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. There are many commitments by the Taliban to the US in that deal, which has not yet met, and for sure that will be very difficult to address. For example, a group that has so close ties with Al-Qaeda, a group that is sharing the resources, a group that is sharing the human power, making a commitment, a very strong commitment to basically fight Daesh or ISIS in Afghanistan, I think is too ambitious. So far, we have no evidence to show that Taliban have broken their ties with Al-Qaeda. And this has not even been through through a press release, so they have not really indicated anything about this. On the other hand, there is no mention of the safe havens of the Taliban in the region, something which really needs to be addressed thoroughly at some point, because if we are talking about a lasting peace, we cannot have a lasting peace if there is a machine that's basically producing disposable fighters. So for sure, peace will be a very complicated process. It has always been. The experiences shows that there are always challenges, ups and downs. We have to be ready for that. There are a lot of elements around the peace talks in Afghanistan. One of them is the proxy wars in the region. That's also going to be a challenge. Although we have seen some verbal commitments from Pakistan for their cooperation, but if things get complicated with the region between the countries, for sure that will directly impact the peace process. So I think we have to be realistic that it will be a long peace process. If you want to have a dignified peace process that is going to be easily implementable later on, we should not wrap it up quickly. It's not a process that we should be wrapping it up quickly. So it needs patience, and it has to go slowly, and with strategic patience, and also discussing the elements that are important for the people of Afghanistan. In terms of the realities on the grounds too, it's important to realize that it's a different Afghanistan today. The people have changed. The new generation has totally changed. The young generation is not willing to sacrifice their gains and their achievements of the past 20 years for the dark days they have already experienced during the Taliban regime. So now that the negotiation teams have agreed on the framework of the talks, we still have collective concerns over Taliban targeting civilians. This concern is shared with our international partners too. So the efforts should be focused on basically reducing the level of violence. We also heard that the negotiation team will be holding their next round of talks over the agenda on the 5th of January 2021. Definitely there is a recess. It's also normal to have breaks during the negotiation. That's basically giving both sides to reflect and to think of how to come back to the table. But we hope that this recess in the negotiation table will also make a break in reducing the violence, or at least stopping killing civilians. For sure, again, when we start talking about the agenda, the expectations of both sides are going to be probably difficult and different and distant from each other. So, for example, Afghanistan government, we definitely want a ceasefire, and that's really important. But Taliban, they might have a different opinion about the entire situation. So with these in mind, I think we can expect a long process, and in order to be able to overcome the situation, we need to be patient and work around the interests of the people of Afghanistan. So I think I have to stop here, and maybe I can discuss any further questions later on during the discussions. Thank you very much.
Naveed, thank you very much for that. Can I just ask you one, I won't put you on the spot about stuff at the moment, but one sort of historical question that keeps coming up and bouncing around. Lord Bruce mentioned the British and the Russians, or the Soviets and the Americans. Were there times in Afghanistan's history when it wasn't in such an international spotlight, that it muddled along without the sort of violence and so the different factions all knew how to mix together without the external powers interrupting them?
Definitely, Afghanistan has always been a spot of the attention for many years. We historically know that, but the country has proudly coexisted together. It's a diverse country. They have lived in peace with each other for a long time. For sure, that there has always been difficulties and challenges which we know of historically, but the people of Afghanistan, looking into them, we have seen that they have been living peacefully for a long time, respecting their diversities and differences of opinions. We have seen that we are basically a multi ethnic with different groups and sects living together for a very long time. So it means that there are opportunities and there are potentials for the country to basically regain and rejoice basically on the values that they have shared for a long time.
So it is governable, essentially, that it is not who governs it, that as a nation it can be governed. Definitely. Yeah. That's good, because this takes us on to our next speaker. Thank you very much for that, Naveed. This is Dr. Orzala Nemat, Director of Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit and a Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. The reason I asked that question, Naveed, is because Orzala is going to be speaking to us exactly about donor dependency, the governance of Afghanistan, and looking at the history of donor dependency and its present and future, and how these relations need to be set to find out who is going to govern Afghanistan. So Dr. Orzala Nemat, the screen is yours. I do apologize. We've lost the connection to Dr. Orzala Nemat. So we will go now to and we have other technical problems with Francesc Vendrell, who was going to be our last speaker, and now we're going to bring him up because he's having some camera problems. Francesc Vendrell is the former UN Special Envoy and EU Special Representative for Afghanistan, and Francesc is going to focus on the current talks in Doha that we just heard about from Naveed and the potential scenarios stemming from their outcome. Francesc Vendrell, the screen is yours.
Can you hear me?
And we can see you.
You can see me?
We can hear you and see you.
Very good. Excellent. Well, I'm glad that the previous speaker has mentioned that it would take time to achieve a settlement. And I think he's absolutely right in saying so. Normally, negotiations move forward when the parties believe they are stuck in a mutually hurting stalemate. But the question is, in my view, there is an element of stalemate, although perhaps the drawdown of the American forces and of NATO forces from Afghanistan may lead the Taliban to believe that time is on their side, something that they have in fact been stressing for a long time. The agreement between the US and the Taliban left a lot to be desired. It was basically an agreement that ignored the Afghan government or Afghan political forces, and that is something that is going to harm, I think, in my view, the process. I think one needs to understand what are the core interests of both the internal parties and the core interests of third parties. Now, by that I mean, what does the government want, and what do the Afghans want? But more importantly, also, what does the Taliban want? And I'm afraid that so far there has been no indication that the Taliban is seeking some kind of power sharing agreement with the government. And I rather suspect that at least until the new Biden administration is settled down, I think there is unlikely to be any particular progress. You also have to, of course, take into account the interest of third parties. And that means, of course, taking into account the interest of Pakistan, Iran, Russia, India, and of course the US. I like to say the European Union, but I'm afraid that we play a very marginal role at the moment. So I think that the third parties do agree or do believe that it is not in their interest for the Taliban to take full power in Kabul. But that doesn't mean that they have any clear idea as to what the solution should be. In my view, it's unfortunate that there is no UN mediator. It would seem to be the case. Ambassador Khalilzad, in some ways, is a mediator, but at the same time, he suffers from the fact that he also represents a party to the conflict. The Qatari government is attempting to mediate, but for the moment, I don't see any particular progress. Let me simply mention a couple of things regarding the ceasefire, the talk of ceasefires. Typically, in negotiations with a guerrilla group, the government wants a ceasefire as soon as possible, and typically let's say the insurgent group does not. They feel that giving up on fighting would deprive them of a major weapon against the government. Also, I should also mention that ceasefires that are not monitored and seriously monitored by a neutral third party are unlikely to last. At the end of the day, I think that one has to plan for a verification of the final agreement. Now, that's a bit long term, because I don't think that we're going to see an agreement anytime soon. So I continue to believe that it would be in the interest of the two sides and in the interest of the third parties if the United Nations were to deploy a mediator who would cover not only the intra-Afghan dialogue, but also would take into account the interest of the neighboring countries I've just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There were a couple of things that struck me that I'd like to put to you, if you don't mind. You talked about the Taliban not wanting a ceasefire. It's not in their advantage, and no agreement soon. And we heard from Naveed Normal about the long process that is going to take place. Is it a process, or will patience run out on all sides at some stage, and it just goes back to what we've been used to over the decades? How long can the patience stay whilst it keeps moving towards a real settlement?
Well, again, a lot depends on the mediator, on having a mediator who will perhaps decide to give a pause to the talks and eventually resume them when, after he has done a shuttle diplomacy, trying to get the parties back into step. So that would be my answer, actually.
Okay, so we are talking about, in real terms, we're talking about another 10, 20 years before maybe a next generation comes up and does what Naveed Normal says, is that it refuses to go to the dark days again.
Well, 10 or 20 years, that is perhaps realistic, but we are looking into futurology. I can only I only feel comfortable seeing what might or thinking what might happen over the next 3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years. Okay. Thank you very much. And technology, which has come on a great deal since the 2001 American intervention in Afghanistan, where I understand that, or I know that some American troops just used old Soviet maps to find out where they were going. We are now going, I think, to Kabul, and we have Dr. Orzala Nemat, Director of Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit and a Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. And just to say again, before we lost her, Orzala is going to speak about donor dependency and the governance of Afghanistan and how it might all unfold from here. Orzala, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hawksley. My apologies for the bad connection. As it happens, I'm not in Kabul. I'm in Europe, and sometimes even technological challenges and issues does not recognize borders. It's a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. I'm really, really grateful to listen to Mr. Vendrell, to see him in good health. That's really great. And also other respected speakers. I'm sorry that I had some connection problems before. The topic that I have to speak within the framework of today's discussion, who will govern Afghanistan and how Afghanistan will be governed in future, is focusing on aid dependency. We've heard from distinguished speakers. Lord Bruce started the event by highlighting the historical context of Afghanistan. And if I take you quickly back to the history of aid dependency in Afghanistan, we all know that since the time of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, when serious state building was considered for Afghanistan, particularly institution building, Afghanistan relied on outside sources, financial sources. At that time, the British Empire was funding Afghanistan's state building through Indians. At that time, India was, of course, under the colony. So historically speaking, the issue of state building in Afghanistan was always funded by external resources. And while in the process, investing money on this country, which had its own self-governed form of governance, but with the help of the external supports, the priority was given on ways of governance in state building that was more important to external forces as opposed to building internal systems. For example, something that historically no one really worked much on, and I can argue even now, is the issue of taxation and how that could be tackled from the very beginning. As a result, we remained more like a rentier state, sponsored and supported by different global powers, and that is also not an exemption in the last 4 decades of our history of wars and invasions. With the Soviet invasion, the funding came from the USSR of the time, from the Soviets from one side, and of course the other opponents funded the Mujahideen forces. And over the fall of the pro-Soviet regime we had, I will not take you to the history, but to look at it, historically aid dependency has been part of Afghanistan's modern or contemporary identity. Now, the idea is not to much go into history, but to see what will happen and what is happening now and what will happen in future. A few weeks ago, we had the Geneva conference. Over the Geneva conference as well, we've discussed about, pledges from different countries, our allies, international countries, international institutions. They have made pledges to Afghanistan that at least gives us some level of security between now and 2024. But there is no assurance on this in the longer run, in future from this point onwards. And that also gives us the same level of concern that probably years ago we could have the same, which is what will happen afterwards? What will happen in the context of this peace process? I heard respected presenters before me talking about the peace process, although I'm not 100% sure that from what is going on, we will have a tangible results in terms of ending the violence and war that is going on for the last 40 years, as it's kind of PR sort of communications is telling us. But at least there is some level of hope now that maybe there will be a settlement. So under that context, I think, the Geneva conference is good because it buys the time until we reach that political settlement agreement. But in this process, it's a huge responsibility over the government of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan in general, the civil society, all groups, but also over our international partners in helping us to move on from the usual buzzwords of, sustainability, transparency, and accountability. Potential sources of funding for future of Afghanistan is revenues. I think we are still having huge challenges when it comes to revenues and the revenue collection mechanisms. There is a lot of corruption going on. There is patronage politics play into this that needs to be, looked at and revised. We should also be careful about the new form of dependency, which is through loans. For example, Afghanistan should definitely learn from the experiences of African countries and Chinese relations, and how to sort of make sure that we are not falling into any of these traps of becoming completely a slave under the loans without any sort of conditionality or accountabilities. The same way is the importance of the other source I can say is the humanitarian source and assistance. That is a global sort of obligation to assist Afghanistan in terms of addressing global challenges. All these SDGs and achieving them requires resources. So the governments and people should jointly work really to find out ways in which assure that Afghanistan can be part of this world by addressing those challenges and achieving those goals in following the 2030 agenda. And finally, global partnerships with different countries on different investment projects, on different development projects. Having said all that, of course, I didn't mention the security. Without any doubt that the first and top priority in the case of development assistance is the question of security and this funding of our security forces. And for the government of Afghanistan, I believe the strongest challenge is to make sure that how in the future of political settlement, if the violence reduces, if the violence actually ends conclusively, how to make sure that the approach towards building the security institutions changes. Now they are aggressive, they are violent, we are aware of the civilian casualties and all that, but how to rebuild their mindset that is no longer the same. Before I conclude my remarks, I would also like to mention that when we talk about the aid dependency and external funding, we should also remember that our the other side of the violent conflict at the moment, the Taliban or any other forces that are fighting the current government, they're also not very genuinely grassroots without any connections to outside. So there is that invisible. There are two strong, invisible, significant sources of funding and aid dependency in Afghanistan that we don't see them. It's not necessarily aid in the right way of, supporting development and humanitarian, but aid that comes, the money that is spent on in Afghanistan and on Afghanistan. These are money that is spent through the insurgencies, causing terrorist activities and actions and in all the violence that we are experiencing. There is also another sort of what I call usually elephant in the room, and that's the illicit economy that is extremely powerful and influential across sectors across the country, I would say. And that also is something that is a strong source for funding all kind of licit and illicit sort of political activities. Governments and non-government or anti-government are all sort of one way or another earning from it without this being addressed. So I think we have to keep these points in mind when we think about the future and how Afghanistan can build in real meaning a kind of a more independent or standing on its own feet type of future political system, as opposed to what it is now, which is really making us extremely independent on our international partners. Thank you very much for your attention. I can't hear you, sir.
Because I muted myself.
Oh.
We're all this technology thing, but thank you so much for that. I'd just like to pick up on something to encapsulate it in a way. Is that you said that since the British Empire days, the state building in Afghanistan has been funded by outside sources, whether it's Russians or the whatever, and those sources fund those areas that are in their national interests. So there are certain intrinsic things that I think we're going to hear more about later from Dr. Timor, Sharan, that don't get built. And this has been the history of Afghanistan. There's a sort of cultural mindset that this is how it works. At the moment, you've got promises up to 2024, which is just 3 years away. And then nobody really knows what's going to happen against that. So they're all going to start working out how to keep internally and externally, how to keep their national interests afloat. So what is it that's going to break through? That seems an intractable situation there. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked over the centuries or the decades that we've seen. What would break through that in a nutshell?
Well, it's very difficult to see what will break it through, but I think there is a strong stand that should be taken from by the government of Afghanistan. There is a huge expectation, but also by the government's sort of opposition, the Taliban. We are seeing that at the moment. I was critical. I said briefly that I'm not very optimistic about getting any kind of tangible results from what is going on in Doha at the moment. And I'm saying that because I don't see any actions other than focusing too much on how to make sure that all elites, political elites, are represented in this negotiation team that have to go there, and how the sort of rule of the game or rule of the engagement should be defined. There's an extreme. You were talking about about the time frame, and it's like from now to 4 years, 3 years. Let's remind ourselves that the time when we decided that we should move towards a peaceful solution to this conflict was 2010, the London conference in 2010. That was a remarkable time when we said, let's move on to peaceful solution. War, violence, counterterrorism did not work. So now I think it's a huge responsibility which is shared between the donors, the opposition, the military opposition, the Taliban, if they really are seriously thinking of partnering in rebuilding Afghanistan and not partnering in terrorizing Afghanistan or sending it back to the Stone Ages. They have to get together and find ways. I mean, I get excited to talk about the history here, but we are also have to remind ourselves of why, for example, the King Amanullah's time there was a failure, because he stopped getting external funding. What happened? He couldn't survive because he was relying on taxation, but taxation needs return. What are we returning to people if we extract, but we not give anything back to them? So the breakthrough is expected. I think Afghanistan has more knowledgeable people, more educated people. I mean, knowledge I cannot say very well because knowledge is not equal to education, but there are plenty of Afghans, from economists to people, experts in finances, in lots of areas. It's just very, very disappointing that corruption is so widespread that it will be very difficult to rely on things that are said and not enough done on that front.
Yeah, it's a tricky. I mean, it seems that it needs, like, say, the US gave Asia or Europe or somebody a security umbrella for decades and decades, so that everybody feels safe to drive in the same direction. And instead, what you've said here is you've got something for the next 3 years, and that's only going to be a little bit. But I'm now moving on to Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards to take this thought a little bit further. Lucy is the author and a former political advisor to the EU ambassador in Kabul, and she's going to look at precisely what we're discussing now, the role and interests of regional powers in the future governance of Afghanistan, and of course, the change, if there's any, the potential impact of the incoming Biden administration. So Lucy, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you to Lord Bruce for organising this event and inviting me. And very interesting to reconnect with some of the other speakers, including Ambassador Vendrell, who I worked for many years ago now. My interest in Afghanistan really started about 21 years ago when I first went to Pakistan. And so it's been a few years really since I was deeply engaged with the country. So coming back round now and listening to what people are saying, it feels a little bit like deja vu. I think particularly when we're talking about the peace process, which has of course now been going on for roughly 15 years, and always hope and then pulling back and then you just hope that things are going to work out. And it seems that we have the same problems holding us back. And my belief really and I'm looking at this with a larger perspective now, because of my interests have now moved on a little bit from Afghanistan. They're still very much geopolitical and global political affairs and so on. But I feel that looking back on my time in Afghanistan, and in fact this was the book that I wrote, which was about the peace process, a solution that was offered by Commander Abdul Haq at the time of 9/11, but was ignored by the Western powers. My feeling is that there has been so much bad faith reporting on Afghanistan. I feel that the media, the Western media in particular, is guilty of looking at the situation through a very particular prism. And there's a very particular narrative, and I find it very, very limited. I think when one looks more widely at issues, for a start, I would say that the 9/11 is an absolute linchpin issue that needs to be deeply assessed. It hasn't been properly investigated. And of course, 9/11 is the reason, we are told, that we went into the war in Afghanistan, that the invasion of Afghanistan, essentially by the US and NATO, took place in 2001, in October 2001. And yet that's never discussed, it's never brought up. But yet, when I was living in New York in the last few years, I came across architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and there seemed to be some very, very serious issues with the official story of 9/11 that are never aired. And I think it's important to contextualize this when we're looking at a war that has now gone on for 20 years, has cost trillions of dollars, looks to have no end and no exit, and no sustainability really in terms of how are Afghans going to get onto their feet in the future? How are they going to be able to start to self-sustain? And obviously it's particularly difficult with not just the situation where you have competing powers around Afghanistan, all with their own interests, but where you have a narrative which I feel is very, very limited, with the prism through which we're looking at these things. And just to give some examples, I would say that we need to look at the drugs trade more honestly. We need to look at the military-industrial complex and its role in the Afghan war and perpetuating the war much more honestly. We need to look at as I've just said, 9/11 needs to be properly investigated. We need to look at who's funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I mean, on my last visit to Afghanistan, I was told by several commanders who were previously men who Abdul Haq had been working with and others who I met, that the US was actually transporting terrorists and bringing them and dropping them in certain locations such as Wardak and so on, and funding them. So there isn't any honesty really in the dynamics, the underlying dynamics of this. Now, General Mike Flynn, of course, who was Trump's national security advisor, who has spent the last 4 years fighting this Russiagate investigation, which has found nothing against him, had actually criticized and talked about the funding of the Syrian so-called rebels, and made similar allegations that in Syria rebels were essentially being funded by the West. So I think we need to look at who these people are, who's funding them, a more honest conversation about how we're using proxies in these countries. I mean, the situation in Syria and Afghanistan, there are parallels, definitely. With respect to the comment that Orzala made, I thought it was a very good comment that there needs to be more engagement on the level of the people, the Afghans, and what they want, not just what surrounding elites from different countries want. It really, I felt that from my own experience of Afghanistan, the issues were never about democracy and about the well-being of the Afghan people. This was about strategic, big power plays. It was about military bases. It was about the drugs trade and the CIA and the use of the drugs trade to fund black operations all over the world, not just in the region. Essentially, the Anglo-Zionist empire. When we're talking about outside powers, I think we definitely need to include Israel. And talking about the powers, I mean, obviously with the US, it's rather difficult to talk about the US at the moment because we're still in a disputed election. I mean, there's a lot of assumption by the media that Biden will be taking office, but somehow I suspect that might not be the case. So we can't really talk about the US as just sort of one entity. You can potentially talk about the US deep state, and you could talk about the interests behind that. And the Democrats. Definitely Trump has been an outlier, which is why he's been so targeted over the last 4 years, why it's been so difficult for him to achieve what he wanted to achieve in terms of his campaign promises. I think that's partly why he wants to withdraw troops from Afghanistan at the moment. But really the US, if we have a Biden administration, there needs to be less, in my opinion, if we want to bring about more peace in the region and in Afghanistan, less anti-Russia rhetoric, less anti-China rhetoric, more engagement, for example, with the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Roads. And yes, I mean, I think also more engagement with Iran. I find it absolutely astonishing that the Iranians weren't really officially included in the Doha agreements. I understand that the Taliban are actually engaging with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and that they are not wanting to talk to Ashraf Ghani. So, I think we just, again, you can't ignore Iran. There are 3.5 million Afghans living in Iran. So we need to shift the focus somewhat, shift the prism, and be a little bit more honest, all of us. And I think I would particularly say the Western mainstream media needs to look at things more honestly in terms of its reporting, in terms of who's really behind the drugs trade, what it's really about. Orzala was talking about illicit activities. Quite a lot of the Western states are at the very least complicit or allowing these activities to take place. So it's a complicated situation, and I'd say that a little bit more honesty would go a hugely long way in helping to establish a better platform for peace and dialogue in the next decade to come.
Thank you, Lucy. That was a grim picture, I think, you painted there. You took what we were hearing from Orzala about corruption to a sort of completely different level, of which I think many of our colleagues have heard similar accounts of a lack of honesty about what the West is actually trying to achieve. And as you were talking, I remembered that today is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of what we call the Arab Spring in that time. And that was when it began in Tunisia, and then it spread through Syria, which you mentioned, Egypt, and the rest of many of us know what happened here. But this was essentially Afghanistan was the first conquest in the war on terror to bring democracy to the Middle East or the Arab world, and then a panoply of fantastic things would fall down from heaven and everybody would be happy. Well, that didn't happen, did it? And I think when you mention the drugs trade, the 9/11, the military-industrial complex, these are all elements that have come into the debate of why it didn't happen, and possibly compounding the argument about what good have foreign regional powers actually done. When we heard from Naveed at the beginning that Afghanistan as a nation, when they're left alone, can quite in a sort of muddled but respectful way, muddle along together. But I just wanted to ask you one thing from that. You wrote a book called The Afghan Solution. Can you, in one sentence, tell me what that solution is now?
What the solution is now?
Yes.
Well, I think the solution now, unfortunately, this was a solution that existed at the time, which
yes,
people who had the power to make decisions were very, very aware of, but they chose to ignore it because it was never about having an Afghan solution. It was about having a top-down manipulated situation where Western governments and Western interests could impose their proxies onto Afghanistan and work through them. I myself was involved with elections 2 or 3 times, actually at least 3 times in Afghanistan. And what I witnessed was it was not a democratic process. I'm not saying Western elections are perfect. Actually, as we've seen with the US, far from it. I feel, though, that there were elements of Afghan democracy that were completely and utterly ignored, because this was really about manipulating a situation to appease the Western domestic audiences about what our involvement in Afghanistan really was. It wasn't about working with Afghan processes and Afghan local governance and Afghan norms and traditions. It was about the sort of pretense of a Western style of democracy, while behind that facade, all of these things like re-establishing the drugs trade through bringing back these warlords was really going on. And they were establishing international mafioso networks of pure corruption. And of course, it's going to end up as a completely unmitigated disaster, which it has. I would say that there have been very little gains in Afghanistan. I lived there during the Taliban. I'm not saying that the Taliban were an ideal situation, but at least there was peace. You didn't have all these attacks the whole time. And obviously one has to grow from something like that to develop. We are not going to be in a situation where we can keep the Taliban away forever. I think Western donors are essentially bankrupt. We're about to have a massive economic westernized financial crisis.
Sure, yes.
Guarantee that we're going to be funding Afghanistan for very long indeed. Our fiat currencies are on the verge of collapse. So I believe the solutions were which should have been from within the country, and it shouldn't have been about a sort of Western media manipulated Potemkin sort of vision of what was going on.
Great. Let me take that on. Western manipulated position, top-down Western proxies, because we're now going to Nargis Nehan, former Minister of Mines and Petroleum, advisor to the President, Treasurer in the Ministry of Finance, and founder of Equality for Peace and Democracy. Nargis is going to, I hope, address the top-down Western interest, because you're going to focus on the role of women and resources and the path towards real democracy and real self-sufficiency. So this is getting away from all these donors and all this other stuff. Nargis, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to put on record my appreciation and support for Democracy Forum for arranging this important event. And I hope that all of us as experts that you're working inside Afghanistan as well as outside Afghanistan, we have some important highlights and takeaways from this discussion and be able to implement them and take them into account while contributing in Afghanistan's peace process and development in any way and any capacity that we are engaged in. I would like to mention a few points before moving to development, prosperity, and path to democracy in Afghanistan. Despite all the challenges and all the pessimism that we are all talking about the peace process, I'm personally, but very cautiously optimistic, because I remember that in 2010, the peace process was initiated by President Karzai after a grand event of Loya Jirga, consultative Loya Jirga, that he invited more than 3,000 men and women from all around the country and consult with them, and everybody say that yes, we should move ahead and we should have peace with Taliban. And after that, of course, he formed the High Peace Council. But then what we saw that between that time till Ambassador Khalilzad was appointed as the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, we saw no progress in the peace process in Afghanistan. And while the government kept on offering and trying to convince Taliban for the peace process, Taliban never accepted to talk to government, and instead they kept on escalating the violence. So today, by seeing the Taliban that they signed the peace agreement, though we are not happy with the content of the agreement that's signed between the US and the Taliban, but despite all the criticism that we have, still it's a step forward. And then we saw that the negotiation teams were introduced from both sides, although we have our criticisms about both the negotiation team of the Republic and as well as the Taliban, but still it's a step forward. And now, yes, it was 2 days back that we had a joint statement coming from the negotiation teams that they stalled the negotiation for 22 days to be able to consult the topics of the agenda and then resume the negotiation. Although it has been very slow and the progress is not as significant as all of us are expecting, but still it's a step forward. And at least the willingness that is coming from the government and as well as from the Taliban side, and the attention and the support that's coming not only from the international partners and allies that we have, but also from the Islamic and neighboring countries, encouraging both sides for the peace process, I see that as a major step forward, and I see that as an opportunity for all of us to work through and make sure that this time we seize it properly, and we seize it to respond to the needs of Afghan people and rather as the concern and challenges of the Afghan people, rather than coming up with our own aspirations and trying to paint that what kind of Afghanistan every partner would like to have as in the long run. So that's a step forward. And then secondly, one thing that should be really important for us is the Taliban. I personally believe that we have overestimated and overrated Taliban when it comes to Afghanistan conflict. Afghanistan has been in conflict in the last 4 decades. Yes, Taliban are into existence for more than like 2 decades or 2.5 decades, but we did have conflict even before the existence of Taliban or the formation of the Taliban. So our conflict inside Afghanistan is not as simple as we think. And even if we sign a deal with the Taliban, it might reduce the violence, but definitely it's not going to end the violence. But then the question comes is that even if we sign the peace agreement with the Taliban, with all the problems that we have inside the country domestically and all the problems that Dr. Orzala and as well as other speakers talked about, especially Ms. Lucy, about the role of international community, the way that they have supported Afghanistan last 2 decades, the question comes that can we have a sustainable peace or not? The question that keeps on coming, and none of us are looking into that model, is the model of Bonn agreement. We did have a model that then in Bonn, where all the parties came together and they weren't encouraged and they were supported by international community, and we produced the Bonn peace agreement. But then the question comes that if we produce that agreement, even if we for 1 second put the Taliban on the other side and then look at the domestic situation on the Republic side, we need to ask the question that have we really achieved a sustainable peace that we were expecting from the Bonn agreement or not? I personally, as someone that I have worked in the government and as well as in the civil society, I believe that for development, prosperity, democracy, and of any society, we need 4 important elements that somehow I personally think that we miss some element of them in Afghanistan. First of all, you need to have strong leaders with the leadership capacity to be able to give the vision to the people, to guide them, and then be able to heal people and encourage them to work together and become a nation. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, that is totally missing. What we saw among the leaders that, especially during the elections, because they know very well that none of them have delivered to their constituencies. So the only way that they can convince their constituencies to support them and vote for them is to go with the ethnical tickets. But they don't even understand as responsible leaders that by going with ethnicization of the democracy and the elections, they are bringing further divisions in the country that is already in conflict. But nevertheless, they're continuing to do that. Second is the governance and rule of law, for which you need strong state institutions to deliver services to the people and maintain security and rule of law. Unfortunate case of Afghanistan, while billions of dollars came and invested on the state institutions, as someone that I worked in several ministries, what I saw that you might have individuals that they will come and they will try to drive a reform and try to build up the system, but there is no political will in the higher level to actually say that, yes, we need to strengthen rule of law in Afghanistan, we need to strengthen governance, we have to provide services to the people. And the third element is the human resource. Now, human resource is the only element that I'm optimistic, not because of anything that is done by the government, but mainly because of the people themselves. I think the number of scholarships that came to Afghanistan, the number of higher education institutions that we have in Afghanistan, the amount of support that came for providing technical assistance, technical vocational training, and as well as education training, we see that Afghanistan as a society has really changed. The 2 groups that we are very much optimistic about, and we see them very much vocal, consistent, and very, very clear about future of Afghanistan, are the women and youth of Afghanistan. So I see that as a silver line, despite all these challenges, that we can look into that and see that how we can further empower them to be the front face of the change and transformation of Afghanistan. The 4th element is the capital. We need resources to be able to generate, so that for that we are able to run the states and design large-scale development and economical programs to be able to build the economy of the country. Now, Afghanistan, once again, is lucky because while everybody is looking at Afghanistan as a landlocked country, but also Afghanistan as a bridge that is actually connecting the Central Asia with South Asia, with East Asia, with West Asia. But the question is that, can we bring enough of security so that these countries can trust us? Secondly is the mineral resource of Afghanistan. While, it's very, very unfortunate that Afghanistan is having one of the most valuable untapped resources in the world, and it's not being developed at all. As someone that I worked in this sector for almost 3 years, and that is mainly because of, once again, lack of leadership and mostly corruption, because you have mafias in these groups that they still prefer to have illegal mining, illegal trafficking and all these illegal economic activities rather than trying to formalize them. And then as a government also, we, even at least when I was in the ministry, we tried a lot, but I don't think we were able to come up with the legal framework and with enough of the incentives for the private sector and as well as for the illegal miners to encourage them to formalize their activities and work in close collaboration with the government. So for us, the lesson learned from the Bonn process, I believe, is really important, because if we ignore once again Bonn process, first of all, it's going to be yet another quick fix. Secondly, what I see the role of international community, especially as someone that I've come into civil society, the way that I see donors are working with local partners and the way that even they're supporting the civil society, it's more based on their aspirations and based on their own models that they have gone and they have worked in another country and they think that that can work very well in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, yet again, they are designing programs and they're coming and they're implementing them without any consultation with Afghans. And I think that instead of bringing unity and strengthening the position of the different groups in the civil society to work for more division between groups, democracy, to be able to move that, I think it's very much important that we look at the political structure of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the international community post-Bonn agreement decided to work with a small number of Afghans that either they were coming from the groups that they waged jihad and they had their domestic support just to make sure that they're in the process and they're not sabotaging anything. The international community decided to not only work with them, but also totally close their eyes on whatever they're doing in terms of political capture in Afghanistan. Secondly, they decided to work with a group of Afghans that they had come from West as diaspora with very limited information about political dimensions and sensitivities of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, both groups in their own way could not take the country forward. Instead, we see all the confusions and all the conflict that right now we have in Afghanistan. The second one, which is important, is the balance of power between center and provinces. Somebody was talking about local governance, and I was just thinking to myself that, do we really have local governance? Because everything is happening in Kabul. Everything is decided in Kabul. We don't even go to provinces. The other is the political capture. We have to make sure that after this, state institutions are not used as a political capture. We have to fight with corruption, and we have to transform these institutions to provide services to the people. Yeah. Inclusivity is really important, and inclusivity should not be only the men and women that either they're coming from political families or they're coming from the countries that they're supporting Afghanistan. Inclusivity should be the real men and women that they're living in this country, they're working for this country, and they have a vision for this country. Monitoring of the process is really important. The last point that I want to mention is that staying true and consistent is very much important for us. I think the reason the Taliban are very strong today is not because they're really strong. It's just because they're very consistent, even in the demand. But we have not, and we kept on changing our position. And the last point is the development and adoption of a national foreign policy for Afghanistan. Foreign policy is very much important for us. As mentioned by Dr. Orzala, we have been always dependent on donor support and other countries. But then other countries are also coming with their own pros and cons, providing support to Afghanistan. And actually, that has not helped us out in terms of bringing the country together and focusing more on Afghans taking the responsibility, generating more revenue, developing the country, and then making sure that we move the country forward. There are models of the countries that they were supported at some point by other countries, but they managed to move forward. They built their economy, and today they are at least economically self-sufficient. I would like to conclude my points here. If there is any question or observation, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much on that. I was noting down some of the phrases you were using during that very interesting, rather depressing thing. It's corruption, strong leaders, rule of law, no political will to reform. That sort of scenario that was being that you painted there. These were the same phrases that were being used in 2001 and during the peace conference. So has anything moved on is it possible to get real democracy and self-sufficiency in Afghanistan? And really, I guess the point that I'm trying to get over is the donors, these outside people that prop up the state that we heard about earlier, are they a help or a hindrance?
I think our job is much more difficult than 2002. In 2002, at least people didn't have the experience of corruption, political capture, and lack of consistency that in the international partners. Today, even when we are talking, we keep on asking ourselves that, can we really do that or not? Why? Because first of all, while the international community is constantly encouraging the Afghan partners, including the civil society, to fight corruption, raise their voice. But when they raise their voice, even when they bring very clear cases with the evidence, nothing happens after that. The only thing that happens is that they're being pressured, they're being exposed, and they're being isolated from even by the international partners themselves.
Sorry, could I just butt in there to clarify, because I want to move on after this, is that it's more difficult now to create a peaceful and self-sustained democratic Afghanistan than it was in 2002. Is that your view, that it's gone backwards in that respect?
On one hand, it's very difficult if we move with the current people, with the current model. But on the other hand, if we give the lead to real Afghans and the civil society, women group, youth groups, these groups are the new groups, and they can come up with the model of like how we can build Afghanistan, how we can fight corruption. But they have to be in the front phase. They have to lead, and they have to own the process. Not that our partners come and they decide that who can lead what and who can do a better job, rather than Afghans deciding themselves.
Thank you. So this is get rid of the top-down Western proxies that Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards was telling us about. And I hope Dr. Timor Sharan, who is the former Deputy Minister at the Independent Directorate of Local Governance of the Afghan government, and that might sound terribly official, but I have a sense that he might begin to give us a solution, because all of us that have traveled the world a lot know that real governance belongs at home and in your community and in the neighborhood around you. So this isn't top-down Western proxies I hope you're going to be telling us about, but the subnational governance, the local governance angle. So Dr. Timor Sharan, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Let me thank the Democracy Forum for this fantastic conversation. Good to see some old friends. But maybe I'll make 4 key points and then talk about the implication. One being unpacking your question, essentially. We have unpacking subnational governance in Afghanistan. We have 45,000 villages in the country, official councils. They're supposed to have official councils. We have 387 districts in the country, 34 provinces, and 160 plus municipalities. And if you add the political representation to it, to the administrative side, we have more than 450 provincial council representatives and 249 members of parliament. Hopefully that gives you a hint of the complexity and the inflation of actors involved in Afghanistan, in delivering services, in achieving peace, and so forth. So this is going to be quite a daunting task. We're not discussing informal institutions and structures that are in place, including tribal jirgas, community shuras, community development councils, and so forth. So it's a huge and massive number of players who have a strong stake in the future of Afghanistan. As my colleagues pointed out, and that takes me to the second point, which is the structure of the state that we inherited or developed at the Bonn Conference and subsequently 2002 Constitutional Loya Jirga or Grand Assembly. It gives Afghanistan a very centralized political system, a very Kabul-centric model that excludes the majority of Afghan population from decision-making processes that would impact their life, including service delivery, economic growth, and conflict mediation. The voice, what I'm trying to say, the voice of the local people at the village, at the 45,000 villages of the country, are hardly being heard. And that itself presents a massive challenge in terms of what we have inherited. So that raises the question, will the current political structure be able to accommodate, reconcile, and integrate effectively Taliban ex-combatants and commanders into the system? The third issue, and again, it was raised by my colleagues, so I'm not going to discuss this. My upcoming book talks about the role of political networks in post-2001 Afghanistan and political order. And essentially what we have discussed, the state has been, both at the national and at subnational level, been captured by powerful political networks, various networks, whether that is the former jihadi networks or the technocrats or individuals moving from civil society into politics. Not only that, the state structure has been captured, you look at the customs, land acquisition, mining industry was mentioned, some of the fuel and gas industry, most of those have unfortunately been captured by these political networks, which then brings me to the fourth issue. And if my colleagues could upload that slide that I had, it would be grateful. I would be grateful. So this shows the flow of resources, at least the basic mapping of the flow of resources in Afghanistan. And as you can see, it depicts different industries, logistical industry that was empowered and enriched by international military presence in the country. The huge sums of money that came to the country produced new elites, powerful elites who are now members of parliament in the Afghan parliament, and they exert huge amount of control, huge amount of resources and power at the subnational level. We mentioned extractive industries. 42 members, in my book, I talk about 42 members of parliament having direct and indirect access, control of extractive industry mines in the country. At least half of our parliament are involved somehow in some sort of illicit economy. The case of Kabul Bank in 2009, that hasn't been resolved since then, which many described it as a Ponzi scheme, gives you an interesting picture of how some of these resources were captured by individuals in Kabul and in the provinces. Now, on the other side of all of this discussion, there's a lot of resistance at the community level. So communities in Nuristan and Kandahar coming out and resisting both corrupt officials at the village, at district level, but they're also resisting the Taliban in areas. People have come out, and in a recent example of Kandahar is fascinating, when the Alakozai tribe collectively went to the Taliban and asked the Taliban not to attack, to withdraw from the district, their entire operation, because it was the pomegranate season. So you'll also see a lot of resistance to the Taliban and areas that people have preferred some sort of a self-governance, including some form of justice mechanism, justice service delivery for themselves, and that gives us an interesting indication of the possibility of exploring those sort of bottom-up approach to developing the future political system in Afghanistan. Now, very briefly, in terms of implications, and I think if you could get rid of the slides. Thank you. So in terms of implications, all of these are going to have massive impact on the peace process and post-peace settlement, including reconciliation and reintegration effort. One, there will be a massive changes required at the political level in terms of power sharing efforts, but not just in Kabul, but in the provinces and districts of the country. We're talking about the Afghan government being the biggest employer in the country. So we're talking about hundreds and thousands of jobs that the Taliban the soldiers, fighters would demand to have those positions in future government. In places like Kandahar, there will be significant restructuring of the tribes and power dynamics that will have a huge impact. Secondly, there will be a massive changes in terms of the resource flow and who controls those resources. We know that Taliban controls significant resources in the south and southeast and other parts of the country, whether that is the timber industry or recently the crystal meth and opium. But they would be demanding having access to the customs and customs revenue in places like Kandahar and Nangarhar and others. So there will be contestation and conflicts in play between the Taliban and those who control resources at the moment at the subnational level. Thirdly, there will be obviously a necessary change required within the security forces. We don't know how that would look like, but I can envisage that the Taliban would want to see some sort of integration of their forces into the Afghan army. And we know that Afghan police and other units have been quite entrenched. And you know, one study that we did at IDLG during my job was that at least in the northern part of the country, we had over 1,200 illegal armed groups, some of them up to 2,000 armed men. So we're talking about the challenges of getting the Taliban in, but also confronting these militia groups that are going to be in play. What I'm essentially saying is that this is not new, because the political networks in Kabul have been exceptionally good in presenting the facade of political order, but at the subnational, there have been significant degree of violence and disorders. At the same time, having that many number of actors in play, there's likely to be quite a lot of spoilers who would act to undermine this process at the moment, but more importantly, the post-settlement effort. Having said that, the Taliban will be tested. They haven't been tested. They haven't delivered on any of the promises that they promised with the US Taliban deal. The Afghan people, especially at the village and the district level, are yet to see the Taliban delivering on reduction of violence, delivering on allowing service delivery in parts that they contest and control, and then so many others. They haven't delivered it. So we are yet to see the Taliban being able to deliver to the Afghan communities at the subnational level. More importantly, the Taliban will be tested on service delivery. Right now, 87% of services delivered by the Afghan Republic side. We are yet to see the Taliban performing at those levels. And Afghanistan's today, as my colleagues noted, have significantly changed over the years. According to the latest survey of the Afghan people, 84% of the population, including over 67% in rural Afghanistan, do not agree with the values that the Taliban are promoting. So that would give you an indication of the challenge that they're likely to face in a post-peace settlement. And finally, as the case of Alokozai tribe in Kandahar shows, as they prolong the peace effort and reaching an agreement, they will come to struggle to maintain some sort of credibility when it comes to the tribes in the south and southeast. Let me end there for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. Again, it's there seem to be a series of intractable problems, but you've given a glimpse through of what might happen. But let me just ask you this, if I can. You've got 45,000 villages that were essentially cut out of the structure of state in the Bonn conference, and that's been going on up until now. Can that be fixed easily? Because you have these vested interests, you have everything that you've just described. And am I right in thinking that unless that can be fixed, unless you can give power to the villages or the towns or the people where the Taliban are going to be absorbed and get the jobs going there and give real power there, Afghanistan is not going to be fixed?
So there are three issues here. One is political representation. We know from the last 20 years what has worked. What has worked is the National Solidarity Program and the succeeding the Citizen Charter Program in developing community development councils at the village level, with the highest number of political representation in decision-making by communities at the village level. 49% of the members are women. 51%, according to my data last year, were women members. And 49% of those councils, women were the leaders heading those councils. Okay. So you have the councils at the village level, then we establish clusters CDCs, which is basically looping 3-4 villages together to enable them to pool resources. And then the idea was to link them with the districts in the country. We know giving voice, political voice in decision-making processes to the villagers, it has been effective in delivering good quality services at the minimal level, at that level. Administratively, we have failed miserably because everything has been Kabul-centric. And by allowing the cabinet and the president on top to make all of the decisions for the entire population and not allowing flexibility, innovation, best practices to emerge from the bottom, we have failed our communities at that level. And that means we really need to reform the political structure, the state structure. And we have a momentum on our side, and that is the Taliban are going to ask for some sort of a different political system. We have learned so much from the last 20 years. There is a space for us to give both power and administrative decision-making to the communities at the village and district level. How to scale village-level political representation and administration to the district and provinces, that's a different story. But we have some wonderful example through community work and the tribal jirgas, where people have consensually come together and appointed representatives, which has cost the Afghan government absolutely nothing. The good example of that was the recent Loya Jirga, which was only conducted. The entire Loya Jirga election effort was conducted with $1.2 million, whereas our presidential and parliamentary election cost us $240+ million. So you see, we haven't really looked at Afghan ways of coming up, Afghan ways to solutions to our complex problems.
Okay, thank you. That's given a very clear picture. Now we're going to open it up to questions, of which questions are coming. I'm bundling them together a bit. There's a lot about international donors and interference and that, but there's one for Francesc Vendrell here that I'll put. Is Francesc, if you're with us, and I can see you still are.
Yes.
You talked about having a UN mediator for this, for the long-term approach, but a number of the people here are saying, well, because the international community as such is being blamed or whatever for it, is that useful, or will the UN mediator possibly just be another international face that is going to mess things up?
Well, yeah, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We're in the question and answer session, so it's going to be a bit to and fro at the moment.
No, of course, the UN has been the traditional good officer or mediator in Afghanistan between 1981 and 2004 or 2002. So it strikes me that of all potential mediators, the UN is best placed. Although I agree it should not be, if the UN became a mediator, it should not be one of the mediators, but the sole mediator. And I agree that at this point in time, for example, the US, the current government in the US, and probably Ashraf Ghani himself, probably do not wish to see the UN play such a role. But I don't see how you can achieve a settlement that is acceptable to both the internal parties and to the neighboring countries without a kind of envoy that would tackle both the internal issues and also the issues with the countries that are also involved in Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. You said something interesting there that I'd like to kick on to Dr. Orzala. Nemat, are you still with us? Orzala? Yes.
I am.
We heard just there, it has to be acceptable to the people of Afghanistan and also to the neighboring countries. But doesn't that then bring in this issue of vested interests and all the rest of it? I mean, is the UN, is the UN just one of these other top-down vested interests international players, or can it really help?
I am sorry, I cannot hear. I did not hear the how you said. Sorry, the line was not so good.
Okay, I'll try once more. The UN, is it seen in Afghanistan as just one of the other international players, this top-down interest proxy thing we've been discussing, or can it really help come to the sort of situation that Timor Sharan was telling us, where you can give real power to the villages and the provinces and have a self-governing democratic or whatever you want to call it, Afghanistan?
Precisely, Mr. Hawksley. I would like to build upon what Mr. Vendrell was mentioning.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, I had an interview with a local newsletter called Itla'at Rose in Darien. It's also translated. The whole interview was about the role of mediator, and I've explained there about the third party and how that is so critical in the case of Afghanistan in the intra-Afghan dialogue, because in the intra-Afghan dialogue, it's supposed to be Afghans apparently speaking with Afghans. And of course, internationals are there, but traditionally speaking, the Afghan mindset is always seeking for a third party to come and mediate. Probably every conflict is the same if we look at it, but we have the history of something we call solace bil khair. I mean, this is a This is an Arabic term, but is also very common across Afghanistan. It's translated in local languages, in Pashto, Dari, and others. So in that sense, I think having some elements of the society as part of this process that are non-elite, that did not participate in the 40 years of, I know that people say, let's be realistic. Sorry, I'm not talking about another planet or discovering something new here. I'm talking about the destiny of people who are not like me sitting outside Afghanistan. They are living there, their children are there, and they are suffering from it. And they don't have any political interest or vested interest financially, politically, for a position or anything. So national level, I think for people, it's really critical to have a role. The Independent Human Rights Commission, a few days ago, we had International Human Rights Day. They have highlighted the importance of at least starting some sort of a tribunal, not necessarily in a very formal and luxurious way, but at least having a channel ongoing every day for both negotiation teams listening directly the voices of the victim of this war. They say
a truth and justice thing that they had in South Africa.
Retributive, because we need to build this, because without reconciliation, this war will not go anywhere. We are not, I say I'm not very optimistic about this. It doesn't mean that I don't support. Of course, I support if this will result in one less person that will be killed or injured. I am happy, and I will say this is a positive process, but I'm not entirely. Let me just one additional point I have to make regarding the three different things that we need to make a distinction when it comes to international roles. The role of mediator has to be considered different from the role of facilitator and the role of guarantor. This process so far does not have a guarantor. The Americans are coming to an agreement with the Taliban, but on very specifically definitions of rules that are directly interested the American side of the conflict. We need guarantors for this, but the UN experience, with all due respect to Mr. Vendrell being here, has not been a very successful experience in the case of Afghanistan's 40 years, nor in other cases. So is there any other ways that we can look into this?
There's one that sort of dovetails with this for Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards. Are you still with us, Lucy? Yes, you are. Good. It was coming off from what we just heard and what Timor Sharan said. Is there enough will within the Biden administration to change mindsets in the way that we've just heard? And it is a dramatic change that people are looking for. Can you see anything there?
I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration, I feel that many people who believe that they got rid of Donald Trump and that there's going to be this wonderful new era of peace and prosperity under Biden are sadly mistaken. Many of the neoconservatives from the Bush administration and also Obama, who of course started so many wars under his tenure, are going to be moving into the Biden administration. So I don't know that there's necessarily going to be a lot of credibility there, or actually any interest really. Many of the people in the Biden administration have very close links with the military-industrial complex. So there's not going to be a great deal of desire potentially to bring about peace in Afghanistan. I think it's a actual war.
Yes, that's. I just want to switch that to Francesc before we go on to the next question. Do you buy that argument, Francesc?
Yes and no. I mean, there have been 20 years since 2001, and neither Democratic administrations nor Republican administrations have handled the issue particularly well. So, but I do want to take advantage of my being asked to speak for a moment, is the Bonn Agreement in December 2001 was not a peace agreement. It was a political agreement reached in order to draw a roadmap to stabilize Afghanistan. The Taliban were not present. The Taliban were refused to be listened to by the Americans in particular for until around 2010, 2011. And so there's never been a peace conference. But I do want to say that it wouldn't have been possible in Bonn to have gone down to the level of local government. What happened, and the great mistake that was after the Bonn conference, the United States first lost interest in Afghanistan and worried much more about invading Iraq. And secondly, instead of supporting new civil society forces, they supported the former warlords who, as we heard today, still have an enormous number of militias spread around the country, and which will also prove to be extremely harmful. So I think this was a great.
We heard, yes. Thank you for that. I just wanted to bring Timor, Sharan in at the end before we go to Barry Gardner, because Timor, I think you've sort of encapsulated how things could work. If you had 2 minutes with Joe Biden, because that's all we've got left, could you tell us what you want from him and how it would work?
Well, thank you. 2 things. One is that what I hear and what we have seen in relation to the Taliban, there is not going to be much progress till we have a Joe Biden team in place, and that the American administration outlines the new administration outlines its policy towards Afghanistan.
Could you encapsulate what you want that policy to be? Because you're sitting, I know you've just flown in from Kabul and you're going back. You're sitting in the hot seat, as it were. What do you want him to do?
Well, a couple of things. One is, look, we need space and time. We understand that the Americans and the international community are leaving Afghanistan, but we don't want the repeat of Vietnam in 1974. That already the Americans have made significant concessions on our behalf without actually consulting the key stakeholder in the process, the Afghan Republic. So a more realistic, a smart way of looking at Afghanistan is needed. The time and the space is needed, given that everything has been delayed in terms of the timeline. We need to see changes in the timeline so that we have enough time. And I think that is coming out from the Europeans as well, that maybe this process needs to be delayed and thought through. The Russians, Iranians, and the Indians are in back-channel conversation, are basically saying, in terms of this convergence of interest, are saying we want a responsible exit. Yes, they want the NATO to leave Afghanistan. Yes, Afghanistan wants to not to be seen through the American military presence lens in the region, that we want to build on some of the gains that we have done around economic reintegration, trade, and so forth. But we should not rush this, and this should be a responsible exit in Afghanistan, condition-based, so that we have enough time for the Afghan side to sit down with neighboring countries and build that relationship that is foreign policy based on new realities, rather than every single country seeing us through the American lens. I think time and space is required.
Thank you. Time, space, and I think it was earlier we discussed having a security umbrella that lasted for decades, so that there would be plenty of time to work out differences without going to donor conferences every few years. Thank you, everybody. We're now going to hand over to Barry Gardner, who has been listening to the arguments. Lots of food for thought there, Barry. So the screen is yours to sum up.
Humphrey, the four most terrifying words in the English language I have now found are "the screen is yours." Summing up this seminar is extremely difficult. Let me try and draw out some of the key messages from different speakers, and then makes a few observations. Lord Bruce, I think, started off with what many of us would recognize as an essential, and that is that private investment, not foreign donor money, will be the key. The difficulty, of course, is how you incentivize private investment unless you have first dealt with the conflict and the violence. Navid Normal spoke of the people being tired and there being a consensus on ending the war. But he also said that there was only hope for a ceasefire and potentially an end to the killing of civilians. He actually held out very little medium and long-term hope for the outcome of Doha. And of course, when he says the people are tired, I think all of us know that when we're tired is the time that we often make our mistakes. There was a significant omission, which I'll come to later on, I thought, in his remarks. Professor Vendrell asked, in a sense, some of the key questions. What does the Taliban want? The trouble was there was no answer, there's no clarity. He also talked about the future of Afghanistan being imposed by third parties as a huge problem. We don't want the Taliban in power, they would all say, Russia, US, Pakistan, India. But what positively do they want? Again, total lack of clarity. And he gave a very salient warning, I thought, about how the Taliban think that if they give up violence, they give up any leverage in the process. My first ministerial post was in the Blair government as a minister in Northern Ireland. And one of the most important things in the development of the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, was that separation of the political and the military wings of the IRA, such that the political wing was able to get to the point where it eschewed violence and said that it would proceed with exclusively peaceful means. The difficulty here is that there is no clarity amongst the warring groups about what the key issue that is being fought over is about. There was in Northern Ireland. It doesn't seem to me that in Afghanistan there is. And again, that goes back to what Professor Vendrell said about what do people want? What does the Taliban want? What do third parties want? Dr. Nemat again pointed to the fact that state building has always been reliant upon external resources. And the mistake that she highlighted of not being focused on internal domestic systems, I thought was a very important one. And the danger that Afghanistan would remain a rentier state. She also, of course, was the first, I think, to raise quite so clearly the problem of revenues for any state. Where are future revenues going to come from? The way in which actually revenues at the moment are mired in corruption, in patronage politics. And she again counseled, I thought very sensibly, that Afghanistan should not fall into the same loans trap that many other nations, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, have. So it led me to just put a little note here in my book saying, money is like water. It always flows to the lowest level. And it seems to me that that has been part of the corrupting influence of the finance that has flowed into Afghanistan. It has actually taken people down to a lower level, rather than being used as a mechanism for bringing people together and creating hope. Lucy Morgan Edwards, I have to confess, was a revelation to me. And what she said about the military-industrial complex and the drugs trade and the connections there, what she said about the power play that went on in the third parties using the drugs trade to fund black operations around the world, and the way in which the developed world was basically using proxies to conduct its own or to seek out its own benefit. There was much that was really disturbing in what she said, and I would certainly wish to probe it further. Again, though, she highlighted what I think was two key issues. And one is the role of Iran and the reduction that is required in anti-Russian, anti-Chinese rhetoric, and an understanding that the role of Iran plays, and beginning to discuss the role that Iran needs to play in the world without creating a pariah state. And then she also talked about no top-down manipulation. And that, I think, is one of the themes that was picked up by Nargis Nehan and Timor Sharan. The 4 points that Nargis Nehan set out: leadership, the rule of law, human resources. My goodness, here we were 69 minutes into this discussion, and this was the first time that people had actually spoken about technical, vocational training, about skills, about jobs, about all the things that, if you speak to people person to person, they are concerned about for their family. And this was the great lacuna, I felt, in the discussion to that point. It hadn't focused on what the very simple aspirations of ordinary people were. And I was really pleased when we got to that point and began that debate. And about her 4th point, capital resource for skills development that she brought in. So I think that focus of bottom up, not top down, is certainly one of the key takeaway points, certainly for me, from the discussion. And that focus on what is important if you're a parent. What is important is that your child gets educated. It's that your child has a future, that they can see a way forward with skills in life to be able to do well, to be able to prosper, thrive, and have children of their own. She also spoke of Afghanistan being a bridge across Asia and the Middle East, and again she spoke of the corruption in the body politic, illegal mining. She spoke of and the balance of power between Kabul and the provinces, and the importance of inclusivity. And again, this is where do ordinary people see their future lying? How do you build a sense of social solidarity, a sense of social consensus about the fundamental things that everybody wants out of their engagement in society? Engagement in society is about what rights you're prepared to cede to others, what price you're prepared to pay in taxation, revenues to authorities and to government in order to achieve the benefits that you want. And it seemed to me that she really focused our attention on that critical element of the discussion. Timor Sharan, I thought, very helpfully took that on right at the beginning with his 45,000 villages left out of the of their say, 387 districts, 34 provinces, 164 municipalities, 249 members of parliament, all these different elements that needed to be brought together in some way. But that the state was captured by various networks on mining, networks on property and land acquisition. Again, I thought he exposed clearly the corruption that has infected the body politic. He also raised the issue of the illegal militias and the facade, as he called it, of political order. He spoke of moving from a Kabul-centric polity, and it's clear to me that that was to ensure that best practice could emerge from outside of the center, from below. So in terms of takeaway from this, Humphrey, I was left thinking that there's been a hell of a lot of analysis, but there's not much political vision that I can take out of what people have said. Everybody was much more focused on what's gone wrong, what is wrong, the challenges of getting it right, rather than a political program that if I were going on a doorstep as a politician, I would be saying, this is what I can offer you. This is what you and I can build together as a community. And it seems to me that the original challenge of this seminar today was the future governance and the future of Afghanistan. Who will govern and what will it be like? I don't feel that we know the answer to that. I don't feel that we've had answers to that. I feel that we've had a very erudite analysis of the problems that we face in constructing such a vision.
Thank you, Barry. And I tend to agree with you there, but I tend to agree also the bottom-up and the top-down elements that came in there. We had Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards at one extreme telling the problems there, and then we had Dr. Timor Sharan actually beginning to get to the core of it. But as you say, we don't have that political leadership. And I think in my experience around the world, particularly in the developing world and in conflict zones, is that there are many people there that feel their destiny is in the hands of others, and therefore they don't have that generational ability to make decisions because they feel that it might well be taken out of their hands. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, the panel, Dr. Orzala Nemat, Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards, Nargis Nehan, who I think has left us now, Dr. Timor Sharan, Dr. Francis Vendrell, and Naveed Normal, who has had to leave us and run off to another meeting. Thank you very much. The Democracy Forum is going to be doing another seminar next month on a different topic. It's going to be a live webinar, January the 20th, and it's going to be tight. January the 20th, I noticed, is the Joe Biden inauguration, so we can talk about the new administration there, and it will be titled, Shifting Focus on the Indo-Pacific. Does it hold the key to containing China? Thank you very much, wherever you are in the world, for joining us and for coming to this Democracy Forum seminar on the governance of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.